Namaste, dear friends, and it's very good to have you back on this course. In the previous lectures, we've looked at the different schools of psychology. There are many more, but because of the purpose that we want to serve, I've selected only a limited few. So we looked at structuralism, functionalism, then behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and humanism. And with these schools, we focused on trying to understand what was their model of the human being, and thereby what were the methods they were using to understand it, and what was their final understanding based on the perspectives that they had adopted. So one big discussion that comes up in the process is that when we studied out with structuralism, they were talking of trying to understand the structures of consciousness itself. And later on, when we're now talking of biopsychology and these other subjects that are emerging based on more neurological dimensions, we are seeing that there is the whole component of the brain that comes up. And then we have the humanistic schools that are talking of strengthening the mental faculties of the individual, which is responsible for a lot of progress and a lot of drives that the individual experiences in their lives. So the big question that comes up is, what is the relationship between the consciousness, the brain, mind? Does the brain produce mind? Is mind independent of the brain? These are burning questions in the context of psychology, physiology, and many other discussions are centered around this problem. So I thought we can dedicate some time to try to understand what is present in this domain today. What are the discourses that are going on? What is the history, etc. So just giving you the lecture overview, we look at the introduction and get an understanding of what brain, mind, and consciousness are about. And then we go from philosophy to science. We look at some burning debates and cutting-edge research on this. We look at the positions of the different schools of psychology. Then Indian psychology on the relationship between these three and the convergences with modern science. And then neurosurgeon Dr. Eben Alexander has talked about it based on his own very unique experience. Then a synthesis and future research. We'll end with some exercise and food for thought. So the classical mind-body understanding, it raises these questions. Are mind and body separate, or are they the same? This has been a central philosophical question. And this has influenced early psychology significantly when psychology was moving from philosophy into the physiological dimensions into consciousness mind studies. So the point to think is, how is brain different from the mind, if it is? And this is really the central mystery. The great paradox is that the 3 pounds of neural tissue, it generates conscious experience. So how does the brain generate mind and consciousness? Does consciousness cause behavior or accompany it? Can science explain subjective experience, qualia, our qualitative experience of life? And what do Indian traditions reveal about consciousness? More specifically, the brain, as we can see here, is 86 billion neurons, a biological information processing system. There are neural correlates that correlate with consciousness. And then there is causation that is unknown. We don't really know the relationship between the two of them. Mind, on the other hand, is considered to be a set of thoughts, emotions, memories, intentions, beliefs that are all combined. And it is the intermediate between the brain and conscious experience. And what is consciousness? So there are at least 40 terms that are used to describe consciousness. So you see that there is a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity around what we mean by that term. And the term means different things in different places. So here when we're looking at it, it refers to subjective awareness, what it is likeness, the qualia. And then there is science's hardest remaining problem despite advances. So we've not yet been able to find these connections in a very direct manner. So the mind-body problem from the time of Descartes to modern solutions, we'll just look at it. But we see this discussion happening right from the time of the Greeks, and it was a problem of philosophy really. But when we come to a more recent period, we see that Descartes, he highlights this dualism. So he says res cogitans, which means the immaterial mind, versus the res extensa, which means the body or the materiality. So how are they related? In modern solutions, we are talking of materialism. Here, mind is reduced to the brain completely. In emergentism, there is a novel properties emerged from substrates. We'll understand this in greater detail. Then panpsychism, monism, idealism, these have things in common. They're not identical, but there are things in common. So here they consider consciousness to be fundamental and matter to be conscious as well. So what's this dualism of Descartes? So for him, mind and body are separate substances, and mind is non-physical, whereas the body is physical. If so, then how do these two substances interact with each other? So he came up with this very clear declaration of who he is. He said, I think, therefore I am. So very clear distinction between the thinking and the bodily experience. So then we move on to monism or panpsychism and idealism. Here, mind and body are regarded as one, and it rejects any kind of separation of these three. We see that in materialism, mind arises from brain activity. So they say that mental processes are equal to neural processes. And one example is that the thoughts as brain firing patterns. Okay, so that's what thoughts are. And in this case, we also see that what they establish is that if a certain part of the brain is damaged, then the person is incapable of displaying certain functions. But this will be challenged by Dr. Ibn Alexander's experience later on. But so far, this is a very strong position with the materialists. Then we have emergentism, and here they say that mind emerges from the complex brain activity or the neurons. Here the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So there's something more that is acting, and this is like a bottom-up approach. Idealism, on the other hand, says that mind or consciousness is primary, and physical universe is a manifestation of universal consciousness or mind. This is a top-down kind of an approach. So what really, again, the question is the relationship between these three. So this is really the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems that are solvable, here we can say that, okay, mind has information, discrimination, it is responsible for stimulus reaction, and then there is attention and memory. These are all its features. The hard problem is, why do neural processes generate subjective experience? Which varies, because if it was only hardwired to the brain, then all external stimuli should have given the same experiences to everybody. But it doesn't. There is a subjective nature to the experiences that we have. So this explanatory gap persists despite complete physical description. And then there is a zombie argument. It says that there is a consciousness-free duplicate logically conceivable here. Okay, and then moving on to the status. So therefore, neural correlates are identified, but the hard problem remains unresolved. Neuroscience schools and some key theories. So the global workspace theory of Baz and Dehaene, they talk of the information broadcasts when entering into the global workspace. So they talk of the frontoparietal ignition and at 250 ms that explains attention. So they've been able to basically reduce it to very definite brain movements in order to establish its connection with phenomena like attention. Integrated information theory of Tononi. So here he says that consciousness is equal to integrated information of phi mathematically. And he predicts that consciousness in diverse systems. All right. And then we move on to quantum consciousness, where Penrose, Hameroff, and predictive processing by Seth. So what do they say? That quantum processes or prediction error is minimization. Non-computational or ununified frameworks are proposed. So they say that there is something much bigger that is like unifying all of this, and that is what allows consciousness to arise. So what do the schools of psychology say, and what are their perspectives? In structuralism, consciousness is seen as elements. In functionalism, they talk of consciousness as the function, so the stream of consciousness and what does it do. In behaviorism, consciousness is regarded as unscientific and only behavior is what matters. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, talks of consciousness as being limited. So here it's the awakened consciousness that they're talking about, and they talk of it as the fact that unconscious drives are basically what determine actions. In cognitive psychology, they talk of consciousness which is equal to information processing like the computers. And in phenomenology, consciousness is fundamental, it's a subjective experience, and it is primary. And we see also this with the humanism school, that it is important for the individuals to become conscious and they are capable of doing that. So let's move on to the psychophysiology of it, the scientific study of the interrelationships between mental processes, that's the psychological part, and the bodily functions or the physiological part. This explains how feelings and thoughts brings changes to our body. So did you ever wonder why one's stomach might suddenly get upset right before the exams? So there is no apparent direct correlation, but it does happen and we all have experienced it at some time or the other. So what's the burning debate? Is consciousness causal or epiphenomenal? So when we talk of a causal position, what do we say here? That conscious experiences influence behavior directly. It provides adaptive advantage and evolution maintains that it happens so. The epiphenomenal position, on the other hand, says that neural processes cause behavior and consciousness is a byproduct of that. Libet's readiness potential precedes consciousness by 350 milliseconds. So then we have the evidence that neuroplasticity. So this is again another fascinating area of development that's taking place, where they're talking of the fact that the brain is not frozen. The brain is constantly remolding itself. So neuroplasticity is a reality, and mental practice as well as other practices can physically change the brain. So how are we experiencing the brain and what conscious processes are we including in order to shape the way our brain is? Looking at neuroplasticity a little more, so the identification of the brain's ability to change and modify, and it can go on as a lifelong process. So there is never any stoppage to how much we can learn. On the other hand, even if we believe that we are stuck with certain disease, certain chronic disease, it is shown that if you change lifestyle, if you change your own mentality around it, then even that healing can take place almost miraculously at times. So there is the experiences shape our neural pathways, moving from conditioning to plasticity. So a point of reflection here, how the agency of change transitioned from the structure and environment to the, which is external, to the self, which is an internal phenomena. Moving on to the evolution of cognitive theories, so we see that mind influences the brain. Cognitive behavioral therapy talks about altering neural patterns, which we just saw with neuroplasticity, which is possible. And there are several practices that fall back on meditation, because it's in that process of calming the self that we are able to influence and impact the way that our thinking happens, and by that, the way in which our brain is shaping. So consciousness, what is it? Is it self or awareness? There are different states of consciousness that the Mandukya Upanishad in specific talks about. So awake, sleep, dreams, higher states. And then there is meditation. What about drugs and what it does to us? There is a possible sense of identity with awareness. Then is consciousness a thing or is it an activity? I am conscious, or, consciousness is. What verb will we use there? And then modern psychology talks of the process-oriented view. Okay, so what does consciousness make us do? That is more their focus. Moving on to some Indian perspectives. So consciousness, one of the words for consciousness is Chaitanya. And this is primary and fundamental. It's a fundamental substratum of everything. Manas or mind or manas is an internal instrument and not the source of awareness. Body, mind, consciousness are interconnected, but they're not identical. And that's because there is a possibility of looking at them functioning independently. So there's a key shift from what produces consciousness to what reflects consciousness. And these are huge discussions in the Upanishads in particular. So what is the Upanishadic view? So the Upanishads say that there is the Atman, which is the pure, unchanging consciousness, and mind, intellect and ego, which is manas, buddhi and ahankara, are actually only functional layers. Consciousness underlies all of these experiences. And then we have in the Sankhya Yoga view, both of these are paired philosophical or darshana schools. So they say that there is a pure consciousness or an entity known as the Purusha. There is not one, there are multiple Purushas. And this has the faculty of pure consciousness, or it is pure consciousness. And then there is Prakriti, which is the material nature. It includes the brain, the mind, and it is a combination of Purusha and Prakriti that moves everything around us. And then we have some more in Indian psychology that talks of refining the consciousness. So in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there is a talk of the Chitta, the consciousness ground. So the Chitta Bhumi also they refer to it. It contains all the impressions, the tendencies, and how do we rise to a higher state? Through Samadhi, which is pure consciousness. It's a transcend subject and object. And how do we achieve that? Through Ashtanga Yoga in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. He talks of these 8 limbs that progressively refine our consciousness till we can actually arrive at that state of Samadhi. And what are the convergences where science meets ancient wisdom? So we see that consciousness is fundamental. So in Vedanta, this is said that consciousness constitutes ultimate reality. We very interestingly find that Max Planck also adds that consciousness is fundamental, matter is derivative. It transcends brain, so the Atman is ultimately a non-dual with universal, and consciousness correlates global brain synchronization is what modern science say. Then there are multiple levels. So Vedanta to yoga to neuroscience, they recognize that there is not just a single dimensional reality around consciousness, it is a multi-layered reality, and every level has its own expression and laws of expression there. Now, consciousness also viewed as a spectrum in the scientific context from vegetative to transcendent. So what does the integration of Indian psychology and some of its key contributions? So consciousness is development. There is a hierarchical nature of it. Ordinary mind is equal to the contracted consciousness. Meditation can help us expand towards limitless awareness. In the Sankhya Yoga framework, we see that Purusha is consciousness. It is pure, infinite and eternal, while Prakriti or matter is constantly evolving. Consciousness is primary. And then we have the cross-cultural validation, where similar understanding happens from across ancient and modern traditions. The first-person meditation complements third-person neuroscience. And this is the very interesting times that we're moving towards, where these two are meeting. Self-inquiry is being corroborated by what neuroscience is showing us. So what are some cutting-edge research things that are happening in 2024 and 2025, some breakthroughs? And this is very technical. I'll just read it out, and there is a lot more to understand in this. So Perturbational Complexity Index, PCI. So this is the TMS with EEG. This distinguishes the different consciousness states. And the University of Liège is in the process of developing all this. Then in terms of the synergistic global workplace, we have the Gateway Broadcaster Integrator that correlates consciousness level. And then we have the Cogitate Consortium. It's there in Nature 2025. We see the GWT and IIT potentially complementary, and that marks the scientific maturity in consciousness research. But as I said, these are very technical terms, and one would have to be a connoisseur of these subjects in order to appreciate exactly what are these breakthroughs that are taking place. But at our level, I think what is the most important thing is to remember that the concept of neuroplasticity, that the brain is a constantly evolving organ, and therefore our lifestyle, our choices are influencing what is happening to it, and therefore to choose more responsibly, of course. So this was a fascinating story of Dr. Eben Alexander, who's a neurosurgeon, and he talks of the filter theory. So he wrote this book called The Proof of Heaven, which is a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife. And it is like a must read if you want to understand consciousness, talked about by a neurosurgeon himself. So who would know it better than how the brain functions? And he was quite a skeptical person. So he was a Harvard neurosurgeon, a materialist who was transformed by NDE, or what is known as the near-death experience. So in 2008, he was afflicted by meningitis, brain meningitis, and he went into a coma for almost a week, where his neurocortex literally shut down. As a neurosurgeon, he would know that if the neurocortex is shut down, there is no way that consciousness can take place, because if the brain is the source of consciousness, then with the shutting down of the neurocortex, there's no way that he would have any kind of awareness. But the reality was quite the contrary of what he experienced. He went into a very different dimension and became super conscious of many things. He met beings, wonderful experiences that he talks about. And he could see the decisions being made at that level also. And then he consciously chose to come back after 1 week. And that transformed his experience as a neurosurgeon completely. So he has this quote where he says that consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain acts as filter expressing universal consciousness. Brain damage affects expression, not consciousness. So the implications is that he reconciles his near-death experience with neuroscience discoveries. All right. And like I said, this is really from the horse's mouth of somebody who has lived through this reality. And he's had a total subjective understanding of what is consciousness and its actual relationship with the brain that is often attributed by hardcore materialists as being the only source of awareness. And in this context, I would also like to add here that the big question in terms of an analogy that we say is that does the radio produce the music, or does the music exist and the radio is just an instrument to channelize that? So if certain radio is broken, it can feel as if there is no music that is produced, but that is because that particular part that is used to express it is not functioning. So these are important questions to contemplate upon. So let's look at a synthesis, which is an integrated brain-mind-consciousness framework. Here we see that there are 3 levels and they are bidirectional. So brain is physical. There are about 86 plus billion neurons. It is also a foundational substrate. Mind is psychological. There are thoughts, emotions. There is an intermediates between the brain and consciousness. Then consciousness is awareness. There is subjective experience, irreducible to qualia, and one can be a constant witness of whatever is happening. And then there is causation. So there is a bottom-up approach where does brain enable mind? And then there is a top-down approach where consciousness influences mental processes. So there is also this whole idea of reductionism versus holism. So reductionism, it explains that mind by breaking it into neural paths. And this is dominant in neuroscience. So this is really the bottom-up approach. And holism is mind is an integrated whole. Experience cannot be reduced to neurons alone. Then psychology mostly adopts a middle path here. So what is psychology's unique contribution? It studies experience, meaning and interpretation. It bridges biology and lived reality. The brain explains mechanisms and psychology explains experience. So what is some scope for future research and practical applications? So we see there is neurophenomenology in terms of research directions. So this integrates third person and first person approaches. This cross-cultural meditation studies across traditions, consciousness causation, clarification mechanisms, quantum phenomena, testing in consciousness. Then there are extreme states like the near-death experiences, psychedelics, disorders, and many other phenomena. Also the paranormal. There are many kinds of very fascinating areas of study that are happening. And then what are the applications? So in the context of clinical, there is consciousness disorder diagnosis and therapies. And there is also educational application where it is one has to teach meditation methodologies to help individuals become more conscious of these processes within them, as well as there's a personal dimension where consciousness and can undergo an expansion, as well as self-awareness is enhanced. Let's do an exercise on consciousness. Think of how we view the world changes with the change in how we understand the self and consciousness. So the change of the lenses that the different schools use and worldviews that are studied so far to watch our mental processes. And I'll take you through another exercise. And this is a fascinating one. So let's imagine, and please follow me. You can do this as concretely as you can. So imagine that you're standing in front of a mirror. What do you observe? You observe the color, the size, the shape, the texture perhaps, age, gender. Many of these things are observable by the naked eye. Now, if you need to step out for, let's say, an occasion, a party, or if you need to step out for an interview, you will dress in very different manners to suit the occasion. Now, just imagine that you have in front of your eyes, you have an X-ray lens. What are you going to see then? Bones, of course, will see the skeletal structure. Does that change the way you look at the world? Imagine you're stuck with the lens. And on a lighter note, imagine that you have to choose a life partner. What will be the criteria if qualities and values are not taken into consideration? Just by appearance, what would be your criteria for choosing a partner or a friend, or, and if you have a child, then what will you look out for that child? So we see that as our lens is changing, our understanding of the same reality is altered. Now imagine that you have a microscopic lens. What do you see? You'll see bacteria. If you have to now determine your engagement with the world, you would probably worry about, what is the good bacteria, bad bacteria that you have to engage with. Now, is your reality limited only strictly to you, or suddenly you see that there is a lot more interaction that's happening around? Moving on, imagine you have an infrared lens. What happens? How do you look at the world around you? What do you perceive now? And does that influence the way you're behaving? So what we see that each of these realities is a parallelly coexisting reality. And the lens we use determines the perception that we have of that reality, which in turns affects the behavior that we have, and that behavior will then change the outcomes that we experience. Now, the last one in this, I'd like you to put on a quantum lens. So imagine that you're zooming into your hand, you're zooming deep into your hand, or let's say the brain, you have the brain there, and you're zooming into your brain, zooming into the tiniest particles of your brain parts. What will you see there? You're in the atomic, subatomic, electron, proton, quarks, you're at that level. Will you see matter? Are you there? So imagine you've worn this lens and you're looking at yourself in the mirror. Are you there or have you disappeared? If you say I've disappeared, then who's watching? So there is, awareness is there, existence is there, awareness is there. Now you put that lens and look at the world around you. What will you see? So this is what we realize, that when they talk of it in Indian tradition, they talk of the fundamental substratum of the universe being as Sat, Chit and Ananda. Because when we see that everything is nothing but another form of oneself, one of the experiences that can emerge at the emotional level is that of bliss. Another one can be that of love. Imagine, I will leave you with this. I'd like you to imagine that you are stuck with a quantum lens. You're wearing that and you're leading your life. Try and observe how it would change your day. We will come back to this exercise as we look at Indian psychology in greater detail. But I'd like you to practice this very seriously. Imagine that you're wearing this quantum lens and you also know that you exist as such. So once you wear only the quantum lens and try it out, then you adopt the double view. So you're aware of form, at the same time you're aware of the space. How does that change your life? Think about it, and I'd love to hear from you on that. So some food for thought. Swami Vivekananda, he says, you as body, mind or soul are a dream. But what you really are is being, consciousness and bliss. You are the God of this universe. You are creating the whole universe and drawing it in. Think about it. Here are some references. And with that, we come to the end of the lectures for the week 2, where we really talked about mainstream psychology and we tried to understand what it is offering us in terms of the PAN. We tried to understand the implications, and we also tried to do some associations and convergences with what Indian psychology has to offer. Going forward, and with this understanding of the fundamental substratum and the layers of consciousness that makes us up, let's move on to discover in the following week what Indian psychology is all about. Namaste.